Moshi Moshi. Maybe telling people to yell at me on Twitter is not the greatest idea ever.
Studio.
Welcome! This is going to be the most anticipated mouthwashing video. We have to start with a content warning. If you are sensitive to the topics of SA, consider clicking off. If you don't want mouthwashing spoilers, Silent Hill 2 spoilers, Haunting Ground spoilers, or Bloodborne spoilers, play the games and come back to us. If you're hoping I will deep dive into every character and the complexities of gameplay, that is not what we're going to do. I like to take a more abstract approach to discussing character design and game aestheticism. While I won't give you any insight into player mechanics, I will play the games that I'm reviewing all the way through, and I'll look into peer-reviewed evidence which proves or disproves any points I make. I will share those in the caption below. I also want to give a more formal warning for the purposes of moderation. This video is born of an opinion. You do not have to agree with my opinions. You don't have to like my opinions. Based on the feelers I put out on Instagram, it's become pretty clear that the mouthwashing fandom is understandably really easily triggered by criticisms of Anya. And while I can understand why, I want to make it clear that I am not your abuser, and it is unfair to direct that anger towards me. I am a victim sharing criticisms of the horror genre based on what I perceive to be harmful tropes in media, disguised as feminism to insulate creators from having meaningful discussions about victimhood. If you feel triggered at any point in this video, the urge to harass me may arise. I want you to remember that Anya is not a real survivor and I am, and your rage at me is misplaced if you think my opinions are meant to be re-traumatizing. Take a walk, pause the video, leave a dislike, get on with your life, but I will not be harassed for my critique, and you are absolutely out of here if I see any funny business in the comments. And with the ground rules laid, let's talk about mouthwashing. So, why poke the bear? I'm going to start off hilariously with an apology. When I was initially forthcoming about my opinions on mouthwashing and its fandom, I didn't realize how much of a trigger Anya the character is. I should have, in hindsight, but examining the reception of other characters like Angela in Silent Hill 2 or Fiona Belly in Haunting Ground, I was under the impression that the mouthwashing fandom could be more objective in their feelings about Anya. Because she's fictional, she's not a real woman, but to be fair, I should have foreseen the atmosphere that mouthwashing was creating around Anya, and we'll get to that later, but I sincerely believe the assaulted characters of many games appear in order to insulate creators somewhat from a feminist critique, and I see that Anya is an extension of that desire to be safe from criticism. But that having been said, it's my bad for not realizing that in a fandom with young folks with varying degrees of media literacy, poking the bear by coming out swinging about not liking her is not the wisest move ever. So genuinely, sorry for upsetting anybody by dumping my opinion into the ether without this video already having been released. My intention, obviously, it was not to re-traumatize or trigger anybody by having a discussion about mouthwashing. But, like, why are we having this discussion? So, my first introduction into the fandom was through a series of reels, which lobbied criticism about people's inability to get along in the fandom, and it started particularly with a reel about the headcanon at the end of the game that Curly and Anya somehow, like, survive, and they raise Anya and Jimmy's baby. Obviously, at the time, I had no idea what any of that meant, but I was encouraged to play the game because I really wanted to know what about raising this baby was making everybody go insane. To date, I've played the game 5 times, with the last 2 times forcing bias to see if I could emulate what parts of the fandom swore they were interpreting, and we'll backtrack to this as well. While doing my second or third playthrough, something really interesting happened. I stumbled upon pro-life reels regarding mouthwashing's narrative, and it fueled the last 2 replays because I wanted to force a pro-life bias to the gaming experience. I didn't understand how one corner of the internet swore mouthwashing is a story about the lack of access to family planning, and the other firmly thinks it's a pro-life story. And it's interesting to consider both why Anya elicits such a response in people, but also how the same story could be interpreted as completely opposing views. And make no mistake, based on the comment section of those pro-life reels, these 2 sections of the fandom are in direct opposition of each other. And logically, politically, and theologically, the pro-life and pro-choice sects are always opponents. So why on earth do they find themselves then firmly under the mouthwashing fandom umbrella? Well, here's how I conducted my mouthwashing thought experiment. So I played the game first completely blind with no expectations, no notes. I didn't think very much of it. I literally just like played it to play it. I replayed the game afterwards with a notepad, and this time I wrote down anything which seemed kind of significant. I tried to keep outside influences as minimal as possible so that there wouldn't be biases. I wasn't really looking for a moral of the story. I was just writing down things that stuck out to me. And now I went away and I pondered the orb. I did some research into the fandom. I stalked the Reddits. I played Silent Hill 2. I watched a bunch of videos on Haunting Ground. I spoke to some people who had played Mouthwashing, and I asked them to specify what they thought of Anya, pros and cons, and then I organized the notes that I had chronologically taken to get them to fall into the in-game timeline, and then I made mind maps for each character to identify lingering questions. And if you want to see that, you should subscribe to the paid tier of my Patreon. Now, I replayed the game in the context that it's a story about SA, and I took more notes, and then I forced 2 people who had never played the game to play the game, and I ruined my own Christmas party by polling them about what they thought, and then I took a break to reset my brain, and about a month later, I played Mouthwashing one last time, and this time I tried to channel basically the mindset of a pro-lifer to see if maybe I could force Anya's character to fit that interpretation, and then I refined my notes. So, why are we here? This video is not going to labor to tell you without a shadow of a doubt if Anya is SA'd in the game, although I personally believe that she is, and I'm not going to unveil what political narrative I think the game is in favor of. I personally believe this is a story about SA, but I also believe the horror of what happens to Anya comes primarily in the form of a story about a would-be mother under duress who conceives in an unfortunate way and desires to keep her baby. My job is not to convince you to see it this way. This is just my interpretation. My job is going to be to present to you 3 competing hypotheses about what I think this game could be about. And then hopefully we can try to understand together why Anya appeals to these competing ideologies. And then maybe we can posit some theories as to why SA, in this case Anya's SA, is an exploitable business model in the horror genre. Here are the 3 theories that we're going to explore. None of these are original thoughts. Like, these are the most common theories that I've seen after doing a lot of research and looking into what people are saying about mouthwashing on the internet. So theory 1 is Anya does not off herself because she has no access to family planning, but rather because she is unable to provide a life for her child. Theory 2, this is not a story about a random act of SA. What Jim does is an act of SA through coercion, and this is a story about DV. Theory 3, this is a random act of SA. The principle of mouthwashing is to show how Anya offs herself in the wake of a violent crime, specifically because she does not have access to family planning. And I also want us to think a little bit about what mouthwashing has to say about SA in the context of the horror genre. So what might be easily understood through Anya's characterization about that theme. So, assuming we have our research questions firmly in our brain pockets, let's talk about Chapitre 2, what actually happens in mouthwashing. I'm doing chronological order broad strokes here in terms of events, so the specifics of what everybody else is up to don't really matter to me. The context in which they interact with Anya does. So in order, we start with the psych eval. My notable observations, and an observation that was parroted by a lot of other people I spoke to, are that Anya seems pretty calm throughout mouthwashing. Like, she's cagey about doing Jim's psych eval, but she's not distressed to a degree that you would suspect she's locked in a ship with an aggressive criminal. 6 days before the crash, Anya still doesn't seem cagey enough to reflect a violent crime. However, things take a turn at the birthday party when it's revealed that the Tulpar's crew is headed for layoffs. So Anya has her first notable outburst, quote, "I don't have any savings," and then later, quote, "What am I supposed to do?" This absolutely lends itself to theory 3. What I find suspicious is that Anya seems more torn up about the lack of cash flow than she does about being around Jim, who, for the sake of theory 3, we're going to categorize as a violent rapist. I have to talk in a coded way because of YouTube, forgive me. But why isn't she more perturbed? Assuming that Anya has begun at least between day 6 and 8 to begin to suspect that she's pregnant, why is she having a breakdown over the money? And my question is this meant to be an indication that the financial future of just herself or herself and a child are deciding factors in Anya's final decision? Is Anya's core occupation with not having money because she intends to spend it raising a baby? Like, what am I supposed to do about this baby? Or because she plans to do family planning? What am I supposed to do with no money when we land and I gotta get rid of this thing? And I say between days 6 and 8 because 2 days before the crash, the conversation regarding the dead pixel occurs, and this is cited as the most notable scene in the game. And if you're yelling at the screen that Anya doesn't seem perturbed because not every victim is in a constant state of hysteria post-crime, I absolutely agree with you, but I have saved that for another chapter. What I find really interesting, though, is that the conversation about the pixel takes on a very dreamy quality. It's notably more serene than most other conversations in the game, which have a tendency to feel off-putting or conspiratorial. Anya notes the dead pixel in the corner. In the back of my mind, it's always there. She says, the it's in this case could refer to the fetus or the SA, but obviously the it in this case refers to an idea of a problem, for which Curly's reply is, I don't think it ruins the illusion though, it's peaceful. If we're putting ourselves into the shoes of a pro-lifer, and they're not really shoes that I want to wear, but for the sake of argument, I am curious to see how they fit. Does the circumstances of the conception of a child ruin the illusion of motherhood? And is that what Curly is trying to tell us here? We'll assume that he doesn't know what Anya suspects is going on, and even then, this is just me suspecting that Anya suspects that she may be pregnant. It's a lot of use for the word suspect, but is Curly stating that the circumstances of this conception don't ruin the illusion of the ideal of motherhood? Maybe. I think that that's the pro-life way of interpreting this. In reality, this seems more like a dig at the lack of support that Anya has on board the Tulpar. It's a very ironic statement when you think about it, and it's said by a man who just doesn't know better, because his bodily autonomy, logically, is not on the chopping block for the next 8 months in space. It reflects a laissez-faire attitude that we see a lot in regards to women's bodily autonomy when it comes to people who don't have uteruses, talking about women being overly concerned. Like, the attitude is always, well, why do I have to think about it? It doesn't make a dent in my ideal for my own life. For me with no uterus, life remains peaceful. So I think that Curly is meant to be kind of an idiot. He's sort of like the hopeless man character archetype. His best is never good enough because while he likes to seem like he's capable of fixing things, he's just straight up unwilling to. He's meant to be oblivious. Most likely he and Anya in this case are having separate conversations. He doesn't get Anya's implications. He's firmly on the perimeter of what's happening on his own ship. The Tulpar, which sounds like tulpa, has a dreamy ambiance in this conversation that I think lends itself to the air of mystery around what's happened to Anya. Reflected on the nighttime screen is a facsimile of Earth, but it's not quite right. And reflected in Anya's situation is the facsimile of motherhood, but it's been made wrong. In Tibetan Buddhism, a tulpa is a being that you create with intense concentration, with tulpamancy referring to an online subculture which seeks to create imaginary beings using esoteric practices and the power of dreams. Considering all the dream sequences that were met with in Mouthwashing, doesn't it kind of seem like the tulpar itself is a vessel of dreams, a thought experiment in and of itself that asks us to confront this unknowable woman as an outsider looking into her personal tragedy? And perhaps the lack of clarity regarding Anya and Jim's relationship reflects a more esoteric and unanswerable question about how we conceptualize the imagery of birth and the definition of motherhood. What ruins the illusion of motherhood in this context? And at first, I was willing to say that SA absolutely ruins the illusion of motherhood. Like, no questions asked, there cannot possibly be another perspective to consider. But then, while I was writing this script, I was reminded of something from my teenage years. So I knew a girl who was pro-life, and she was assaulted as a teen, and she kept her baby and raised it because she honestly believed that it was hers to keep and raise. And it's not my place to dictate what people do with their bodies. Like, I'm pro-choice, and being pro-choice means that if a pregnancy is viable and you want to continue it, it's your right to do so. At the time, I didn't have a nuanced understanding of choice in terms of being pro-choice. I thought that any pregnancy that occurred under these conditions of SA warranted an immediate termination, and anybody who didn't want that was like wrong and crazy and overly traumatized. But as an adult, obviously, I don't feel that way anymore. We'll call this person Mary, just for the sake of argument. So basically, because of her religion, she really firmly saw life as beginning at conception. And I remember like pleading with her to get an abortion, and she was really insistent that the whatever week-old like it wasn't even really a fetus yet. She was really insistent that the clump of cells was her child, and we can't take this choice away from Mary even now to testify against and convict her assaulter, but keep his child and raise it as her own. Like, that is her decision to make. Curly's ignorance was Mary's definitive, thought-out statement. I don't think it ruins the illusion. And so we find ourselves again at a question whose answer I don't think is cut and dry. Is pregnancy in this context punishment? If it's not fair to say to somebody seeking an abortion that the fetus is a person who warrants life, why would it be okay to say to somebody who thinks that the fetus warrants being born that they shouldn't feel that way and that it doesn't warrant that? And so I realize that this is the unifying debate which brings pro-lifers and pro-choicers together into one fandom. In this regard, I think Anya being bland on purpose, and we'll go back to that later, is a fantastic move. This strange discussion, surreal and vague in tone, asks us to face the extremely dark reality of women's experiences with SA and confront the fact that somebody may choose to move on from it differently than we might. And this brings us to the next bit of Curly and Anya's conversation. After realizing they have about 8 months aboard the ship left, an infamous question is asked. Why is there a lock on the med room door but not on the sleeping quarters? To which Curly replies, it's most likely that it's the same as the reason there's a lock on the cockpit. Safety. In the context of SA, this is very literal. Anya's safety is jeopardized because Jimmy was able to enter the sleeping quarters. But for the sake of the thought experiment, I wondered again if there was any other interpretation to this scene. Is Jim the pixel? Someone who you trust, who you may be in a relationship with, who betrays you in the most serious way and then becomes this dead spot on the screen of your serenity? Is the illusion of their relationship ruined by the dead pixel of Jim's crime? In this interpretation, the fetus isn't the only thing causing disillusionment. It's also Jim. It's the relationship. So, could there be, then, any wiggle room for which this conversation we're hearing has anything to do with consensual regret? The game goes through pains to show us that these people have met and journeyed together before. There's even specific mention of the Tulpar's crew voyaging together for 5 years. So, why is it so impossible to suggest that Anya and Jim have a consensual relationship, which Jim then betrays through SA as coercion, or even baby trapping? Jim is petty throughout Mouthwashing. He's characterized as being obviously jealous of Curly. So why doesn't it make sense to suggest that in order to tank Curly's image as this perfect captain, Jim is willing to commit a crime against his sexual partner in order to scandalize Pony Express? Is the lock not implied to keep out violent and sudden crimes, but also to remove any room for temptation that may arise between co-workers who A, have a history together, and B, are trapped on a ship for years? And I want to be clear that in no universe am I being flippant about SA or SA themes and Mouthwashing, especially in regards to coercion. My point is that while I understand why this conversation may be captivating for pro-lifers or for women who have conceived under questionable means but who choose to go ahead with their pregnancies, I do strongly believe that Anya and Jim's relationship has a consensual aspect to it. I think in a bid to ruin Curly's standing, Jim deliberately essays Anya in the context of coercion, which falls under DV, and I think that Mouthwashing is a story about domestic violence and not a random crime. Defining sexual coercion has many facets. It essentially refers to putting pressure on a partner, generally in an intimate relationship, in order to get intercourse, which is otherwise not being expressed as wanted by the other party. It often does not involve physical force, and according to Dr. Lawrence, who peer-reviewed the article I use for this section, it takes on the form of tampering with birth control, harassment, verbal abuse, guilt tripping, or exploitation of power dynamics in a relationship. It's a big umbrella to describe SA, not in the context of a random stranger luring you into an alleyway, but rather describes prolonged abuse in a relationship where DV is most often present. When I was doing my think tank, and running my ideas by other players of the game, somebody made a very salient point, which I wrote down and I'm not even going to rephrase. He said, quote, "Domestic violence and sexual coercion so often go hand in hand that they're the same abuse." And this is interesting because when I made my mouthwashing post on Instagram, people in the comments argued with me that mouthwashing being a story about DV did not lend itself to the narrative of SA because grape and DV do not exist in the same context. And seldom do I consider myself an expert on anything. And so I'm going to prove this to you instead with math. So Stats Canada tells us about 44% of DV cases against women reported that SA was a regular part of their experience with intimate partner violence. These cases, which were reported, we are unclear on the stats for unreported cases of DV, so I'm not going to talk about those, but Stats Canada estimated that as of 2024, 6.2 million women over the age of 15 will experience SA as part of DV, alongside psychological torture, their words not mine, and physical abuse. Included within the bracket of what they define as psychological torture is coercion. According to justice.gc.ca, these stats remain stable as of August 2024, and the data they took from was police reports having to do with levels 1, 2, and 3 DV. So, all this to say, coercion is part of SA, and SA is part of DV. So how do we define DV? This is taken from just a regular dictionary. Quote, violent or aggressive behavior within the home, typically involving a violent abuse of a spouse or partner. So this definition does not have to refer to a girlfriend or a boyfriend. This could refer to somebody that you happen to be having casual sex with. Part of SA includes things like stealthing, which is the act of removing contraception during an intimate act, whether to cause pregnancy or otherwise harm. An unexpected pregnancy is a facet of abusing control over a partner, and that's where we get the term baby trapping. In the context of mouthwashing, Jim clearly demonstrates himself to be villainous. We can debate to what degree, if you're feeling especially pedantic, I guess. But what's glaringly obvious in the implications made by the characters is that most likely he does SA Anya. And I hate to say it, but as somebody out there, someone's going to make the case that there's the slimmest possibility of mouthwashing just being a story about getting pregnant and feeling regret. A consensual relationship which goes awry, featuring two partners who cannot decide what to do with this fetus. And I'm not arguing that for the aforementioned reasons. I think the implication that there's at the very least some DV going on here is pretty clear. So we'll end the chapter on the following note. SA is part of DV by method of coercion, and I think that that's what this game is about. So, ifs, ands, buts. Let's talk about it. The next significant event is regarding the gun that Anya hides. Upon discovering, presumably then, that she's pregnant, Anya has a meltdown. Warranted. We don't actually know how long she's been pregnant. To play devil's advocate for a second, we have to assume that this is the first that she's heard of it. If she already knew, it lends itself to the theory that Anya's meltdown is in regards to Jimmy not accepting the pregnancy, as opposed to the events that unfolded to cause the pregnancy. It's possible that his inability to take responsibility is the cause for her freaking out. But if she just found out, then it lends itself to the idea that the pregnancy is so heinous that the cogs have begun to turn as to how to terminate it. And I find the question that she asks to Curly here really interesting. What would you have done? And I wondered on my first playthrough if this was meant to be in regards to them being fired. So what would Curly do to secure Anya's livelihood? Or what would he have done if he'd known Jim SA'd Anya? The latter is a little odd to me because he does know. So does this imply that Jim committed the crime repeatedly? Is she asking Curly what he would have done if he'd known that Jim was a serial rapist? And if so, that's even more horrifying. It means that it's really not a random act of SA. It shows that Jim is capable of drawn out evil, presumably by exploiting his working relationship to Anya. Curly doesn't know about the pregnancy because when Anya announces it, Curly is surprised, but he seems to intrinsically know that Jim is the father. So ask yourself for a moment why Curly intrinsically knows. In my interpretation, it seems like the game is once again hinting that Anya and Jim have at the very least something going on. When Anya decides not to shoot Jim, but rather to protect herself from him finding the gun, does it not sound like somebody cowering from an abusive partner? She says she wants to, quote, make sure he never gets it, the gun, either. So she knows Jimmy. Better, I think, than we're led to believe initially. and she knows that he doesn't want this pregnancy. And so by the time we're 0 days before the crash and she breaks the news to him, she mentions Jim says nothing of value to acknowledge their situation, and then he walks away. And this threw me for a loop for a few reasons. Like, why would Jim Bob the psychopath not absolutely lose it and try to directly murder her, first of all? If he's aggressed her to this point, it feels a little out of character for him to just not immediately lash out. And I chalk this up to poor writing, but in my think tank, we considered the possibility of Mouthwashing a story of regret again. What if there is no violence because the relationship is consensual? What if this is really just a story about a guy who cannot deal with the fact that his girlfriend is pregnant? We thought again of the pro-life crowd because we really did want to understand like how these people got to this fandom. Why on earth are they so drawn to Mouthwashing? I think that this plot hiccup with Jim has very much to do with why. I can't buy that Jim is a violent one-off essayer, because Anya's lack of extreme wariness throughout Mouthwashing and Jim's weird reaction it didn't make sense to me. Jim seems more preoccupied with Curly. He's worried about what will happen. He wants a murder-suicide pact. Obviously, it seems Jim knows he's committed a crime, or at the very least a severe taboo, and if we're doing the reading of Mouthwashing as the tale of regret, he would rather die than face the consequences of his own actions. If we pause here, the events of the post-crash, are really what solidified to me that this is a story about DV. Remember how I said that Anya didn't seem freaked out enough around Jim? There's another character that gives us a hint about Jim and Anya's dynamic, and it's Swansea. Anya not only seems more freaked out by Swansea's outbursts in the cargo bay than she does by the very presence of Jim, but remember when we walk in on Swansea and Anya having some kind of private conversation? Swansea has an axe. Why hasn't anybody attacked the dangerous grapist aboard yet? Anya is shown in this scene to be capable of conspiracy. And with Swansea having no qualms about axing Daisuke in the face, why have they not conspired against the only other reckless and possibly dangerous to Anya man aboard? Anya's hiding of the gun in order to assure her safety, and possibly that of her fetus, and Swansea's final conversation with Jim stick out to me the most in this post-crash section. The narrative regarding coercion is, in my opinion, the worst of our concerns, because it suggests that everybody aboard the Tulpar, including Swansea and Curly, are not only aware that they're harboring a grapist, but have an apathy towards Anya which leads to her death. And this may very well be the point of Mouthwashing, but I think the devil is in the details of Swansea's conversation with Jim after Daisuke is axed. To me, at least, Swansea doesn't seem upset enough. He tells Jim that during his time with Anya, it was she who told him, quote, all kinds of things, but this alludes to very little. I can't in good conscience lead you to the conclusion that Jim's essay of Anya was a random one-off act of violence, because it just doesn't feel that way. If we're to believe everybody aboard knows that Jim essayed Anya and nobody is willing to do anything about it, then these characters aren't sympathetic. It's a story about a gaggle of men who can't take responsibility, and it very well could be. But why then does the inciting factor into why Jim crashes the ship seem to be the presence of this fetus and not the presumed truth that he's a grapist? Is he fleeing a crime, or is he fleeing responsibility? At no point does Anya say she was assaulted. Our hints that suggest this in any regard are that Anya is hiding a gun from a reactive Jim, which I argue could just prove she's in an abusive relationship, and then the conversation about the locked doors. This would be much easier had Anya had any kind of dialogue which outright mentioned essay. And it doesn't even have to be dialogue. Like, not to harp on Silent Hill 2, but Angela's backstory is understood by her own dream sequences within the room where we find her. We infer what's happened to Angela regarding SA, CSA, and incest by the monster which manifests, as she calls it, Daddy. So, why is Mouthwashing muddying the waters of inference? Is it to intentionally create confusion, calling back to the unbalanced and dreamlike energy of the tulpar and its damning imagery of guts and uteruses and guilt? Is it to create a sense that this is a woman in a relationship with an unstable partner? Is it to paint a picture of the jarring and confusing violence which happens during intimate partner violence? Is this a story skewed by Jim, a dangerous rapist who uses coercion to get one over on his friend by treating his coworker as expendable and dehumanizing her? Or is this a story skewed by Anya, wrestling with unsettling thoughts about what this baby may mean for her future? And I think the answer lies in Anya's decision. By the time we find Anya at the table, in the lounge, gazing longingly at the mouthwash, this seems to be the most far away and cagey that we've seen her. All of a sudden she tells us about the storage locker with the meds in it. Anya has decided she is going to die. Anya's characterization swings between hysterics and something of a meekness which I think the fandom exaggerates, because Anya is shown to be capable of conspiracy, foreplanning, and secrecy in order to get her way. She's sometimes almost conniving in her speech, even to Jim. When she's talking to him, her speech is italicized. "You're so capable, Jim." So why would you compliment your rapist? Anya shows a strange degree of compassion for Jimmy. Quote, "Our worst moments don't define us." But is Anya being genuine? Anya's a character I think we can read in many ways. We can say that the italics are Jim's own imagination, a man desperate to be praised, getting off to what a good person he seems to be. But what if the italics are tone indicators? Anya, who conspires with Swansea to lure Daisuke into a pod, presumably, who hides a gun, who keeps secrets about the location of medications, is not an idiot, and her strength seems to lie in deception. So why is it impossible to suggest that she's keeping Jim placated by feigning niceness? The only other reason I can think of for this is, again, the nagging suspicion that she and Jim have a consensual aspect to their relationship, and that she may not fear Jim. She may be weary of him and think he's a douche who's not taking responsibility for his actions, but there's a stunning lack of hysterical fear in a character meant to be punctuated by her own hysteria. Anya's timing with the storage locker is exact. She's taken a decision. Whether you want to argue it's for the benefit of herself or the benefit of her unborn child, we can go back and forth forever, but hers is the only plan in mouthwashing which does not go awry. Everything anybody else tries to execute, horribly wrong, but the one scheme that Anya is able to cook up somehow goes miraculously right. But it's not a miracle. Anya is smart. She is conniving to her own benefit. And this is where I get to dunk on pro-lifers, because seldom do they give a shit about what happens after a baby is born. The idea of a jobless woman with no savings, no formal career, no survival rate in nursing school, having to abort due to lack of access to healthcare and resources is not an impossible thing to imagine. Mouthwashing asks us to consider, what do you do when a child is born into this situation? God knows the modern pro-lifer is not going to vote for policies to take care of it, and I think this is the stark reality in which Anya labors to keep her child, but has to die in order to do right by it. And that's more desperately sad and scary than most psychological horror games. What if the best thing you could do for your child that you loved was to die and take it with you? Like, it's an unsettling question, and it spits in the face of the pro-life movement. It punctuates the idea that abortion is healthcare by highlighting the desperation of single mothers, poor mothers, mothers experiencing domestic violence, mothers in precarious situations. It holds a mirror up to the very real reflection of our often inhospitable society and asks us to consider what we do when this clump of cells becomes a living, breathing child who will inevitably have needs. And as amazing as the conviction of Anya's character is, Anya's agency in this game comes from a place that I find problematic. I think she's part of the great tradition of assaulted women finding agency in death, and I don't want to skip over her demise because I think it punctuates a lot of interesting themes in mouthwashing. Anya asserts that the day that she dies is not her worst moment, but rather far from it, and this can be read as her taking agency for her abortion, or taking responsibility to do what's right by mother and child. She tells Jim he was right and that she should have done this at the beginning, and I think this shows that at the very least, Jim urges her to abort the child. But it left me wondering again, if she said she would not, and that became the premise of hiding the gun. He wants her to abort, she does not. And there's a phrase said in this conversation, quote, "Do you think I wanted this?" This once again points me in the direction that there's a relationship here ending in an unwanted pregnancy. Anya asserts it's the best decision she'll ever make and then promptly dies. But for whom is the dying the best decision? Is it for herself or is it for the fetus? And this is where the waters are muddy. Anya's a great character if you're wanting a character who can be read in many ways. For all of her blandness to ensure audience projection, beneath the surface is Mouthwashing's primary protagonist. Fun fact, in the first scene of the game, if you look in the storage locker, you find Anya's little name tag. Before you even know who it is you're piloting or what this game is about, the first thing you see is Anya's face. This is not the story about the effect of Anya's presence on the Tulpar's crew. This is a story about Anya. The Tulpar is a dream, and it's subject to its interpreter. Pro-lifers can see this story as that of a woman who must die for the benefit of her child. It highlights the importance of doing what is best for the fetus, albeit in this instance in a very grim way. And I think the grimness of what often happens to mothers who have no choice but to give birth is absolutely at home in the genre of horror. It's horrific, and often pro-lifers don't understand how desperate the lives of these women who are forced to give birth are, which drive them to have to choose the nuclear option of possibly dying. People take birth control into their own hands all of the time, and it leads to the death of women. Pro-lifers refuse to acknowledge that lack of reproductive health care kills, including women who want to keep their fetuses, but who for medical reasons cannot and are forced to abort for their own well-being. And this is the thesis of Mouthwashing, the horror of the female experience in the face of uncertainty that is pregnancy. You can interpret the story as one of ultimate betrayal. A coworker, a crew member, a friend who takes out their violent fantasies on your body and leaves you with a difficult and enduring consequences. And you would still be in the realm of reality because statistics are clear. 80 to 90% of women know their rapist from their interpersonal lives. In this scenario, the only thing that you can do to save yourself is die, because there are no abortions in deep space, and you're on a ship of uncaring and largely oblivious men who will not take responsibility for what one of their own has done to you. This is horror rooted in realism. How many of us know somebody, myself included, who are happy to side with our abusers and continue to be their friends, even after they've been made aware of the fact that that friend is mistreating people? Mouthwashing is about isolation, desperation, a disconnected and uncaring crew of men who subjugate a woman into the most extreme corner of her life. Anya gnaws her own leg off to escape the inevitable. Having this child means defeat, and so she must die. And not even I'm safe from the dreamlike quality of Mouthwashing and the intense desire to project onto Anya. When I was assaulted as an adult, it was by a long-term intimate partner, and I see Anya as a woman in a consensual relationship who is betrayed for Jim's own gain. I interpret her as hysterical because she has to come to grips with the fact that a man she trusted is objectively evil and views her as an object. The men of the Tulpar are unable, or perhaps unwilling, to save Anya through their own apathy because they've sided with her abuser. This is a story about DV, because I've experienced DV. And Mouthwashing is just vague enough that I've noticed the similarities between myself and Anya. And on Reddit especially, people love to debate the vague nature of what has happened to Anya. And it's not an unpopular opinion among players that this is simply the story of an unfortunate pregnancy and not SA. In the vein of SA, our evidence is circumstantial. Jim shows that he knows how to spike a drink. He shows that he's more than willing to do so. Anya seems kind of weary throughout. She mentions the lock on the door, and a lot of people mention the phrase that she says, quote, "I don't want him here anymore." It's not lost on me as a sterile woman who had to choose between producing a child or literally dying that not choosing the child is a decision I can't take back. And even that, the illusion sometimes of choice is a deeply haunting theme in horror media. To me, Anya represents a woman who wants her child, maybe even loves her child, but realizes she has to make a desperate decision that she cannot take back for the fetus's benefit, and in this way, I too am Anya. For the most part, people who say this story as being, one of a random one-off act of SA were people who were subjected to that. And I'm not going to decide who has the correct interpretation, because I don't think that this is that kind of a game. It absolutely scans to me that just like I'm projecting onto Anya based on my own experiences, that somebody who has experienced that type of SA will absolutely see that narrative in this game. When we find Anya's body, to me, it seems like her hand is on her womb, almost cradling what could have been. I felt seen for the first time in a really long time by Mouthwashing, of all things, and I understood why Anya had a certain magnetism to her for all of these different communities that would usually be in intellectual opposition of each other. I understand why we've all sort of congregated here to love Mouthwashing. But now is the time to return to our final research question. What does Mouthwashing have to say about SA in the context of horror, which might be easily understood through Anya's characterization? And this is when I realized that I had really, really, really come to dislike the idea of bland on purpose. I want to return for a moment to what I saw on Reddit. So, people claiming that not wanting Jim around was enough to imply Anya had been SA'd. I'm no stranger to CSA and SA, and I share a striking similarity in this regard with Anya. There's one living adult who knows about my CSA, and they caught on to it completely by accident because I had literally said the phrase, I don't want him, my abuser, around the house anymore, and perhaps my tone had betrayed some sort of desperation. But that person, after all those years, understood what I was trying to convey. And yet I connect with Anya mainly not as a victim of SA, but more so as a woman whose choice to have children was taken from her. And I'll let you know something, okay? SA absolutely begets SA. My bio dad was a PDF, which didn't become clear to me until I described the way that I grew up as an adult to a therapist. Because of the people he hung out with, I was exposed, obviously, to dubious men. And the CSA that I survived came from a family friend. But not understanding red flags as a young person, I soon find myself, groomed as a minor into a relationship with an adult man. And that lasted until almost my mid-20s. That person began to assault me not as a teen, but later as an adult. The only reason I got out of this horrible situation really was thanks to therapy. Despite having a huge family and being in contact with people that could have absolutely have protected me from this nonsense, no one stepped in, very Crew of the Tulpar-esque. No one really questioned the situation. No one pried, into the offending parties. So with all of this having been said, why can't I connect with Anya primarily as a survivor? Why is Anya's death important to me? Because I see it as a means to protect a wanted child. I said earlier that Mouthwashing was not a game about Anya's effect on people. It's a game about Anya. And to understand the difference, it's time to turn to one of my favorite horror franchises, Silent Hill. In Silent Hill 2, we're playing a game about James Sunderland. We are not playing a game about his wife, Mary. We're playing a game in an environment influenced by James's guilt, with antagonists as manifestations of his emotions, seen through the lens of his experiences, ultimately in search of absolution for him. But Mary is a significant character, yes? Well, I would argue that we don't have to know much about her because this is not a game about Mary. This is a game about the effect that Mary has left in the wake of her death. This is the story about a landscape shaped by Mary's presence in James's life. Whether or not she's a bit of an unknown, vague in her characterization, doesn't really matter because we don't have to know her intimately to understand the plot of Silent Hill 2. This is a game about James. You are being asked to empathize with James. Mouthwashing, on the other hand, is a game about Anya. Her characterization matters a lot, because while we get to understand Swansea, Daisuke, Curly, and Jimmy, we're doing so under the duress of an event that, if not for Anya's presence, would not be happening. The focal point of Mouthwashing is not Jimmy, because he's not important. Jim could be anybody. We can replace him with any stock character evil man, but the person that cannot be replaced is Anya. Without Anya, this would be a story about a shitty guy on a shitty ship headed for unemployment. But without Anya, there's no reason for anything in the game to happen. We are not watching a crew crash and burn while Anya, like Mary, looms mysterious and almost omniscient, mythical in her presence, felt but not seen. We're leading the events leading up to Anya's death. Anya is not Mary, but she may very well be Angela. In Silent Hill 2, there are two side characters who are significant because they bring about necessary world building, and that's Angela and Eddie. Angela and Eddie are disenfranchised victims who come to Silent Hill to seek answers and ultimately to be punished for their wrongdoings. Eddie is a victim of bullying who later becomes a murderer, showing that Silent Hill is something of an amorphous space which doles out punishment to wrongdoers. James's appearance there punctuates this, as the different endings that you can get can either absolve or condemn him. But why is Angela being punished? Angela, like Anya, is a woman who has been assaulted, except Angela is being called by Silent Hill because she's killed her aggressors. Never mind that this implies that Silent Hill is punishing her for the crime of killing her rapists. I personally don't like that implication. But what's notable is that Silent Hill doesn't have to drive Angela insane. She will not only retain sanity, but in the end, she willingly walks up the stairs into a fire and to her demise. Silent Hill is portrayed as a strange and liminal space where no two experiences are alike, because guilt is sometimes deserved, but sometimes it's unfairly foisted on individuals who feel called to go there. But what about Mary? If she's amorphous, then why is Angela so punctuatedly human? Angela's predicament contributes to the world building. If you meditate on the unknowable nature of Silent Hill, she's filling, like, very literal shoes. She feels remorse as a murderer. She's a victim of assault. The game does not mince words to expound on how fucked up her situation is. We come to understand Angela best when we're met with the abstract daddy monster. Here, in a room with very obvious phallic pistons sliding in and out of holes in the wall, Angela is reduced to a blubbering mess calling out to her father. The monster we fight as James manifests as something of a creature on a bed-like slab, very obviously simulating the missionary position. For James, it represents Angela's assault and his guilt about his sexless, bedridden wife. But we don't know what Angela sees, because we aren't playing as her. And yet, in a non-literal sense, Silent Hill 2 has given us a very clear indication of her trauma. I don't have to be Angela to understand why she's come to Silent Hill. I don't have to play as her or comb through her memories to understand why she willingly walks into the sea of flames. The halls are adorned with flayed male torsos, genitalia on display.
Or you could just force me. Like he always did. You disgusting pig. I hate you.
I'm not going to argue that Silent Hill is subtle in its metaphor here, but nonetheless the visuals are Angela-centric, even though you're meant to be experiencing a Ludo narrative as James. In the end, Angela willingly ends her life, much like Anya, but the reason is a bit ambiguous. She notes that she has always felt like this, like a pillar of burning, and ascends the stairs into oblivion. And so, is she guilty? Does she want to be free? Is Silent Hill giving her a punishment by giving her an out? Or is it giving her a boon by giving her an out? These questions aside, I think Angela is part of the great tradition of female characters, once assaulted, finding agency through death, and honestly, I don't like this narrative. It makes bland on purpose come across as lazy to me. I've been pretty forgiving of the angle that Anya is kind of boring, because she's meant to be projected on. And I understand that the overarching idea here is that the game dehumanizes Anya and doesn't want to give us much insight into her character because we're meant to view her the way the Tulpar crew views her. She's a fixture. Nobody is really mussed with Anya's recollection of events because to them, and now to us, it doesn't matter. It's dehumanizing on purpose. But guess what? It's time for Chapter 6. That's fucking dumb. The idea that I keep seeing across the fandom is that Anya should be dehumanized because it helps to further the point that she is considered less than by the crew. But guess what? The fact that she is a victim of SA is the proof that she's considered subhuman. Or at the very least, if we're all in agreement for this 1 second that Mouthwashing is absolutely a story about SA, then it shows clearly that she's at the very least dehumanized by Jimmy. Because if not, then this narrative would not be happening. Bland on purpose, and my opinion, is a get out of jail free card to be able to say very little about the experience of survivors while insulating yourself from critique. I am not the greatest fan of Angela, because I think that the metaphor used in Silent Hill 2 is extremely heavy-handed, and the reasoning behind her death is extremely vague, and so I just feel that it hasn't aged particularly well. I'm not big on the agency through death thing, but at no point to this day, at the very least, is there confusion about what her inclusion in the franchise was meant to portray. And I think that that's refreshing, that we can call CSA without having to be overly flowery about it. You can even find newspaper clippings detailing that she's a CSA and incest survivor. It's flavor text, but it gives me needed context on Angela, and context, believe it or not, is good, especially when you want to undertake a retelling of brutal SA to further the plot of your game. So my issue with Mouthwashing is that there are interesting tidbits of information that we can gather about Anya, but it shouldn't take me digging through the plot over 5 playthroughs in a month and a half to notice them. And before you call me media illiterate, it's not just me. I think that the conflicting interpretations of Anya are a symptom that we've headed too much in the opposite direction of the very literal Angela. It's not that the metaphor is too heavy-handed, it's not literal enough. And considering Mouthwashing is now critically received as a game about SA, I think it's important to have more consideration for the person who is SA'd for the plot. Bland on purpose is not enough. I need you to show me that you give a shit about survivors by creating a thinking, feeling woman who has at least one non-vague, definitive thing to say about her situation. Anya should be employed in the plot like Angela is to Silent Hill 2, but instead she becomes like Mary, on the periphery. Her effect, and that's effect with an A, on characters is almost omniscient. You get to hear about her through other people, and even then, it's not even really clear what she's been telling them. It's unclear what her motives are, because she's sneaky, juxtaposing, confused, thrown for a loop, but we don't have the opportunity to know her. Which you can absolutely be juxtaposing and confused in the wake of a violent crime. There's a duplicitousness inherently in avoiding our abusers. In order to survive, we have to make concessions. We have to make ourselves calmer, quieter, more pliant. But my problem with Anya is that she doesn't feel like a person. It doesn't feel like those intentions are there. She just kind of feels like she represents the looming specter of SA. And that can be employed conceptually. Not all implications are evil and vague and don't serve a purpose, but I think for the narrative effect that Mouthwashing is going for, that type of characterization is not at home here. The most poignant moment of the game for me is Swansea's last speech, and as somebody who grew up around addicts, the sentiments that he describes are not only something that people in recovery have described to me, but the way that it comes across is extremely believably human. The only part of Mouthwashing that doesn't feel overly forced to me is Swansea's speech about being an alcoholic. It broke the spell of this cartoony indie game and catapulted me into stark realization with a sobering amount of clarity. This is the crowning achievement of Mouthwashing. Swansea is our James Sunderland. Who'd have thunk it? Initially on the first playthrough, where I hadn't really pondered the game's plot, it struck me what a chasm lay between Swansea and Anya's characterization. I noticed immediately how much more Swansea felt like a person with a narrative. A bad person who stops protecting his crew from Jim the maniac and has to axe Daisuke in the face to atone for his lack of protecting him, but a person nonetheless. I think that Swansea fits the maxim of the game. Take responsibility. Swansea takes responsibility for his addiction, for his questionable rationalizing of falling off the wagon. He takes ownership of his problematic thoughts and feelings. Our ideal of an alcoholic is somebody who recovers and then swears off their past selves immediately, who never has another misstep, never again falls off the wagon, vehemently demonizes their past flawed addictive self, who was obviously a bad and terrible person, and who's juxtaposed by a new person that they become, who's forced to be perfect in order to atone. But often that's just not what recovery looks like, because addicts who are recovered and remain in recovery still yearn to use again. The difference in taking responsibility is that they recognize that the dependent part of them exists and choose not to engage with it. Responsibility isn't pretending you were never an addict, it's recognizing that you were and taking steps to heal from a genuine place of understanding of how you got there in the first place. And my sincere wish is that Anya had been written less like the stereotype of a doomed, assaulted woman who atones by dying, and more like a human being, like Swansea. My ire is really that Anya's dialogue is cloaked in over vagueness. It's like she's hiding from Jimmy, but she's also hiding from us, speaking in facsimiles, absorbing hours of time to unravel her characterization. And I know you're yelling, that's the point at the screen right now, because I'm in your walls and I can hear you. But ask yourself, is this the best that we can do narratively? Damsel in distress, bland on purpose, doomed from minute one? When I came across the pregnant horse in the end of the game, I laughed. It was the silliest thing I had ever seen, and in no way does this stupid horse carry the poignancy of Abstract Daddy. Abstract Daddy does not feel silly. There is nothing to laugh at between the eeriness of the homely room, its familiarity perverted, assaulted before us literally by pistons moving in and out, the hysterical Angela illuminated by the glow of a single TV screen, the writhing mass which effectuates sex is genuinely jarring, and even in later levels of the hotel, where we meet these smaller versions of Abstract Daddy, the discomfort remains. It's extremely palpable. It is very upsetting. The ultrasound minigame at the end of Mouthwashing did in no way punctuate the effect of anything for me. It was ham-fisted, silly. It lacks the seriousness for which Mouthwashing's premise calls, and make no mistake, Mouthwashing takes itself extremely seriously. Mouthwashing has been pointed out by many fans to be very much a game which relies on claustrophobia to show how desperate of a situation Anya really is in, and as somebody with diagnosed claustrophobia and agoraphobia, I do think that the premise is extremely interesting. And based on that premise, I think that Anya's descent into madness would have been really cool to see. A woman on the edge, confined, pondering, trying to escape a desperate decision. Will she take up the axe and do away with Jim, the Shining style? Will she have an Angela-esque epiphany regarding her own trauma and go willingly into that good night? Honestly, I don't have beef with the conniving Anya that orchestrates this subtle death wish plan that she does, but I feel like if you're going to depict the effect SA has on women, you can go the extra mile and make her feel like a person. Not just a husk that I can project onto. Make her feel like Anya would understand me as a survivor. Anya should not have simply been made an example of to punctuate the brutality of SA. This story should have fully been about her. I should have felt like I was hearing a survivor's narrative instead of being forced to overthink to find meaning in this fever dream of a thought experiment. And people have their own theories on the horse. For me, in the beginning, when Jim jokes about being sexually attracted to horses, this could represent a genuine sexual frustration, coupled with the fact that he seems happy to spike drinks. This indicates that he has the means and the foresight to assault Anya. He's joking he's attracted to this plastic horse because Anya is his plastic horse, not a real representation of a person, just a prop. Blah, 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 dehumanizing. Wow, this game is a one-trick pony. And speaking of one trick, let's go back to something I said previously. The looming specter of assault. The idea that even if an assault is not shown, its effect is still felt. Do you know what game uses birth imagery really well, even indirectly, to tell a story about consent? Okay, I went back and forth on if I wanted to talk about Haunting Ground or Bloodborne, so we're gonna do both, but I want to take a moment to talk about love of my life and beloved triumph of modern gaming, Bloodborne. Bloodborne is, in my opinion, the best example of feminism through video games. It explores birth, even forced birth, the principle of consent, and the perversion of birth imagery in a subtle yet clear way. And if you're looking for symbolism, it's very easy to find. And if you're not, and you just happen to stumble on the game, you can enjoy it for what it is. You have the opportunity to have these questions regarding consent and pregnancy come up in a very organic way. Nothing ever feels forced, and nothing ever feels disingenuous. There is no shock factor element at play here. Bloodborne is peppered with obvious allegories for abortion specifically. If you want to look at a more sort of in-your-face example, I would say Murgo's Wet Nurse is a great place to start. You trigger the battle after setting off an unsettling children's music box, met with the distant shrieks of an unseen infant. Murgo's name means to drown or conceal. She does not bleed. The only visual cue that Murgo itself is even around is a seemingly void baby carriage with this strange light atop it. It's almost angelic, almost representing the liminal space between being dead and being incarnated on Earth. Murgo's Wet Nurse is not seen. Her clothes are draped over what seems to be dead space, looking like an angel with her many arms. What is she nursing? Why can't we see Murgo? This is an obvious allusion, I think, to H.P. Lovecraft's The Dunwich Horror, wherein an unseen baby creature wreaks havoc as it grows too big to be hidden from the nearby townsfolk. But Murgo isn't the only in-your-face baby in Bloodborne that seems to have something off-kilter about it. Many of the characters have childlike names, like the Orphan of Kos. The Orphan of Kos is newly born, canonically, and has a fish hook in its abdomen as it wields a placenta. Its mother is still partially attached to it. Ask yourself this: should that fish hook have been turned instead into a coat hanger? That's a dark implication, but I think you see where I'm going with this. The storytelling in Bloodborne is sometimes so in your face about its message. For example, Ariana literally gives birth to a thingamabob under the blood moon. The moon's presence itself, impregnating women with abject horror babies, is a violation of their consent and bodies. Bloodborne is trying to show us the brutality of violation of consent, exploring an uncomfortable question about how societies descend into barbarism once they give up their humanity and view reproduction as separate from the humanness of women. And if you think I'm pulling that out of my ass, consider the plain doll. She looks familiar, no? Gurman, obsessed with Lady Maria, constructs a plain and docile version of her, which seems to gain sentience the more we interact with it. In this form, she's non-threatening, placid, Anya-like. He's taken this very real, powerful woman he was fond of and robbed her of agency, reducing her to a ghost-like shell of a submissive ideal, and then asking you if you want to have your way with it. It's really fucked up, is my point. And the craziest thing is, if you're not looking for any of these illusions, you can still play a full-bodied game. You don't have to think hard about Bloodborne if you don't want to, but if you're looking for a kernel of narrative, you will happily find it. Bloodborne does have something valuable to say about violation, consent, conception, without skirting around the issues and causing more confusion than satisfaction in its answers. And another game which is very much in your face about its metaphors is Haunting Ground. Haunting Ground is often dunked on for its extreme sexualization of its protagonist Fiona Belly, but the voyeuristic nature of how we see Fiona adds to the atmosphere of fear in the game, as this is a story where we are constantly on the verge of being assaulted and need to escape. You constantly feel exposed. You feel like Fiona Belly, cold, fragile, at the mercy of this castle and its insane inhabitants who are either trying to assault you or steal your uterus. The host of characters includes Depilitas, who sees Fiona merely as a doll and often will stop to rub his crotch, signaling desire for her body as he chases you down the derelict halls. Daniela is a robo-made homunculus thing who literally wants to steal your uterus and vagina to experience pleasure, and our main antagonists Ricardo and Lorenzo are these like incestuous clone guys who hope to impregnate you against your will with basically your father's jism to give birth to themselves. So Haunting Ground is often praised for its ability to make the player feel disquieted by how exposed you are to everybody and everything in the castle's environment. You are quite literally on display, often donning very scandalous outfit choices, dressed like a doll, while on the run from people who want to violate you to some degree. And all this to say, there are different avenues through which a game might show you that its central theme has to do with violation of consent. Whether it chooses to do so in a very overt manner or more subtly, there are instances where we can glean a sense of the personhood of the victim. We don't get to know Fiona Belly through a series of lengthy monologues, and we only get to talk to Ariana a couple times in Bloodborne, but there doesn't need to be an in-depth Swansea-esque monologue for every character you meet in-game who runs the risk of being assaulted, but giving them a sense of realistic personhood is a creative choice that helps us see victims as people. Bland on purpose, to me, seems like it strips even more humanity from victims. It normalizes their role as things rather than people, and it doesn't add anything to the conversation about how destabilizing this crime is for its survivors. Assault is dehumanizing enough as it is. Why do we have to keep reiterating that victims don't deserve to have personhood through other means? Why is the only solution, the only agency for these survivors being found through dying? Anya should have and could have been fleshed out more in the interest of telling me a story about a woman. Maybe this could have contributed to us discovering the true meaning of mouthwashing. But I think it doesn't really matter. A game which gives people the ability to choose for themselves what they think it's about is often better than a game that goes through great lengths to over-explain its message. So, what did we learn? We learned a lot, I think. You can absolutely interpret Mouthwashing as a game about SA, but if you feel its narrative is more so a meditation on regret, you can interpret it that way too. What you get out of it is entirely up to you, and that in its own right, I think, is special. The tradition of assaulted women being granted agency through death is problematic in regards to what it implies for real-world survivors, and injecting some humanness into female characters is not an indication that we've over-explained ourselves, but rather that we see victims as human and deserving of a narrative. Context is not your enemy. Stories about DV or SA don't have to be shrouded in mystery. It's objectively good to center the narrative of victims at the forefront of a story. My relationship to mouthwashing is complicated because my introduction to it was not the best. The fandom seems pretty attached to Anya for good reason, and very dismissive of any ideas which don't align with their personal experiences. And I think that this is part of both the appeal, but also the fancy trick that the developers are going for when they made Anya. This is the aspect which insulates their characters from a certain degree of critique. This video was almost scrapped because I genuinely didn't want to have to engage with the 15-year-olds on Twitter, but then something real interesting happened. The theme of men refusing to take responsibility found me in my waking life. It's not a secret that I had cancer for a long time, and that recently, since I've been more open about the fact that my long-term partner, left me to die while I was in palliative care, this game seemed topical. When I finally found the courage to leave him, putting my pride about being a typical statistic aside, since women with cancer are often abandoned by their partners, I found that rather than take responsibility and just apologize and own up to what he had done, a really interesting story was being weaved about me. And I've heard all of the versions of this story at this point, from me cheating on him to leaving him out of the blue to a whole host of other really messed up things. It seems like dragging my name through the mud is easier than just fessing up to what was done to me, and that really got me thinking, why is it so easy to antagonize people, to try to cover up your crime and avoid responsibility, as opposed to just making amends and admitting that you were wrong? What drives men to do evil, to see the people in their lives as expendable and usable and not as human beings deserving of dignity? Why is it always women who take the fall from grace and have to disappear, to be quieted and buried? Why is that the real-life equivalent to Angela ascending the fiery stairs to a fiery death? I'm grateful for being betrayed. which I know sounds insane, but it did put a lot of things into perspective, and that pain drove me to making this video. So thank you, universe, for catapulting me into my own Tulpar thought experiment and agonizing over victimhood in order to seek solutions. That's all from me for now. Huge thank you to my patrons. Oh my god, where did you guys all come from? Mwah, mwah, mwah. Smooches for everybody. Thank you to Gwen M, Leo, Delta Animations, Not a Necrowizard, Akuzan.com, BigMonke, Blake, Auri, Noop, Andrea, and Ace. If you felt any kind of way about this video, feel free to pundle that gundle and widgeon that gidgeon. Like, comment, and subscribe. Check me out on my second channel. I do vlogs. Sign up to my Patreon. There is a free tier and you get a shout out in everything that I ever make ever, which is really nice. Come stalk me on Instagram, and please don't yell at me on Twitter because I don't have Twitter anymore. Okay, bye bye. Stay weird. I love you. Bye.